Appreciate that. Those were some soothing sounds, weren't they? And for some of you, here comes my soothing voice. So prepare to sleep. Could happen. There's a lot of difficult issues that come with using the word promise, isn't there? A lot of things that we can confront a lot of times when we use the terms I promise. They can really come back and kind of bite you every now and then. That was my experience not too long ago with one of my granddaughters as we were discussing where we were going. So there's kind of a routine because we like the kids to know how boring we can be. But when we first get them on a Friday night, usually we go to Brahms. And so I'll say, hey, where do you guys want to eat? They'll always answer Brahms. It's not because it's a great place to eat, it's because it's got ice cream. So we'll always know, okay, Friday night we go to Brahms. And then the next day, if I ask, where would you guys like to go now? It's usually the same answer, Steak and Shake. But one weekend, we didn't end up going to Steak and Shake, and I hadn't done that, and I can't remember exactly what the circumstances were. But my youngest granddaughter said, you promised. And it was in full accusatory terms, right? She goes, are we going to Steak and Shake today? I said, no. She goes, you promised. I said, wait a minute. I didn't promise. I never used the word I promise, ever. I never used the word promise at all in our discussion. I said we might go, we might have had an intention to go, all these other kinds of things. She goes, no, you promised. And I just found myself in a manipulationship with my youngest granddaughter, right? And we all know what that is. It's that coming back and forth. Here she is trying to manipulate me with words in order to get me to go to Steak and Shake. Here I am using words trying to help her understand. I did not use the word directly, all these other things, and we're in the midst of a back and forth going there. And so we finally resolved the situation and went to Steak and Shake. So often in our words and our tangles with words, sometimes we fall into manipulationships over funny things like a trip to a diner. It's an entirely different thing to follow into using promises and oaths to take advantage of other people. And that's really what was happening at the time of the Jewish people because of the teachings of the Pharisees and the scribes. This is what Jesus addresses in today's passage. So I want us to understand what's going on here. With the background of this, Jesus is talking about the teaching of those Pharisees and scribes that they had actually put into place. So let's begin in verse 33. As we read, again, you have heard that the ancients were told you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. So the first thing, the issue was not to make false vows. This was the intent of the law, to not say things that you aren't meaning to do. A false vow is indeed committing perjury. That's the idea of it. Promising or swearing something is true or will happen, and yet it never occurs. That's the essence of what a false vow is. It's a perjuring situation. Because the negative approach here says shall not, the indication from this writing is that this was happening. People were, or at least it's the human tendency to make false vows. I don't know if you've ever found yourself in that way, but I certainly have, right? Just to end the conversation, you might say something like, no, I get it, I promise. Worse than that are sometimes the things that we hear, and I hear it a lot on television and other places. Somebody will say, I swear to God. And that's just not true, right? So all of these things are important to recognize, but the last phrase, you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord, this was the counter here to the term of fulfill. So the idea of fulfill is that you pay back everything you owe. You're going to fulfill your vows to the Lord, you pay what's owed. So there's a debt when you indeed bind yourself with a vow or with an oath taking. You're in debt at that point in time. To recognize this is to help us to see that the Pharisees and scribes and many others had found a way around binding themselves. What they had done was decided if we never use the name of the Lord in swearing something, it really is not binding. So they were getting around this. They were figuring there was a way that we could do this that won't make my vow a binding situation. The problem was not in misunderstanding the law. They understood the law. The problem was mishandling the law, taking the law and making it something that it was not intended to do. So basically, they had a flippant way of swearing or making a vow or taking an oath. And the door was open at that point in time for manipulation of one another by using certain words. So in avoiding the name of the Lord, or even using certain words in a certain way, would either make that vow or oath more binding than others, or something that wasn't used, including what was spoken of. Jesus will address this in Matthew 23, where we read these things. Woe to you. Now, understand when Christ says woe, it's a statement of judgment. So this is heavy. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You see that play? So they're using words to manipulate. If you swore, I swear by the temple, that doesn't bind. If you swear, I swear by the gold of the temple, you're obligated. Isn't that interesting? So in our day and age, we can't think of things like that so much, but in this culture, that's what was happening. Christ said, judgment on you. Judgment on you. He goes on, you fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? He goes through various other things, but the point is this. You've missed exactly what God was trying to do with this. You have missed out, and now you're utilizing something in order to manipulate one another. So can you imagine the arguments before the days of recording, before the days of videotape, before the days of all these other things? You said, I said no, right? If there's a video, well, we do have you saying this, which of course all of court transactions are recorded. But when it comes to this kind of argument, imagine that. I didn't. I'm free. I'm not obligated, bound to you. I never swore by the gold of the temple, but by the temple. Isn't that crazy? Please say it is. Jesus will unpack then, back in chapter 5, the truth of this, what's taking place, what's really happening when this situation's taking place. He says this, I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. All three of these things are very important to look at, but he says this in these terms, make no oath at all. Now, there are some groups, Christian groups, that have decided that's how they're going to live. So they will not ever swear an oath if they're telling the truth when it comes to being in a court situation or whatever it might be. They won't take an oath in that kind of fashion. Many Christian groups do that. That's how they feel about it. Okay? That's really not what Christ is saying here. He's not telling you to never take an oath, but he's saying don't take an oath this way. Don't take an oath, think you're getting out of being obligated by it by not using certain words or using certain words. So don't take those oaths. He says this, don't do that. Don't swear by it, by the throne of God or by heaven, because that's the throne of God. Don't swear by the earth, for it's his footstool, his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. See, the point that he's making here is this, you cannot escape involving the Lord the way that you're swearing. You cannot escape involving the Lord. Now, definitely talking to the Jewish people, this would have been a very significant statement based on the fact that he does speak about Jerusalem as well. So he's saying the center, the heaven is his abode, his throne, and the earth is his footstool. He's saying he is everywhere. You're not escaping him because he is everywhere. Even in those oaths they never intended to keep, he's still involved. Because their oaths could include something like this. I swear by Jerusalem. I swear by that. Well, that's purposely intended to not be obligated. How strange is it? How strange is that when we think about what value there would have been in anyone making a promise? That's right, there was no value. There was none. In fact, when we think about really what was going on here, even the Mishnah, which was the collected authoritative collection of exegetical law, teachers exegeting the law, had a massive section. And what it involves is an elaborate discussion on what oaths were binding and which ones were not. So even their traditional teaching as it was established said, this one is binding, this one is not. So they went into a lot of detail to try to figure out how to make this work for themselves. Now, how fascinating is us to see the attempts to prove our purity of motives? That's what we're doing when we swear, isn't it? It actually exposes the truth of our hearts and the motives. But what about oaths that we swear on our own cost? What about those things that we would say, like, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye? Is that the first time you ever heard that? Have you ever said it before? I think I did as a little kid. I said a lot, got in trouble for most of it. But that's an oath. I'm swearing by my own health. I'm swearing by myself. I swear this way. This is truth. I cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. I love those childhood chants that are so horrific, right? Stick a needle in my eye. Wow. We had one when we played games. Tick tock, the game is locked and nobody else can play. And if they do, we'll take off our shoe and beat them black and blue. Hooray! Yeah, man. Hey, we were Western people, dude. Yeah, it was great, except it was kind of wicked, right? I mean, there's so many things that we think about that just kind of we use that just pours out of our face sometimes. We've got to be careful that we're not even using those kinds of things, because these people were doing the same thing. They would say, in fact, I swear by the hair on my head. Can you imagine that if Tim or I are doing that? Right? I mean, it's like, which one? So, recognizing that, Jesus says this in verse 36, which I'm missing here for some strange reason because I did this. Let me read it for you. Verse 36 reads this way, "Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black." Wow. I know some of you went right away to hair dye. I can make my hair white or black, but of course Christ is saying, you are not in control. You're just not in control. You can't make an oath on your own head because you're swearing by your own life, and it doesn't belong to you. You're not even in control of it. When we think in terms of who we are, and especially as followers of Christ, and of course the Jewish people of the time were God's representatives on the earth, and we are God's representatives on the earth right now, but I want us to understand something very important. God owns us. See, it's another act of taking what is God's and using it to manipulate, like these people were doing. Here's the law. We're going to have these teachings attached, and we're going to use the law to manipulate others, to take advantage of other people. What was intended by the law was that we would keep our vows and our oaths. That was the intention. The result of the Jewish people was to create a method of avoiding the binding oaths and vows. In fact, using oaths or swearing as a way of abusing one another. That's what they were doing. Trying to catch one another, trying to trap one another. The chosen people of God were misusing his name, in fact, though they never used his name. Because even their very selves, even the hair on their head, whatever else is the Lord's. The problem is misrepresenting who he is. The problem was that they were misrepresenting him before the entire world. The world that God was intending to reach, this world which he loved so much that he gave his only begotten Son for, was misrepresented. I think sometimes that's something as current believers in Jesus Christ need to keep a handle on. As Christians today in the present day, we must be careful what we do and how we misuse or might misuse his name in swearing. Such the flippant things, I swear to God, should never come out of the mouth of a Christian. Shouldn't happen. Any other oath that's taken in a flippant way, we must avoid. Because words do matter. What we say has impact, and we're here to represent Jesus. He gives the remedy, and I appreciate this remedy so much. But let your statement be yes, yes, and no, no. Anything beyond this is of evil. Now, fascinating in this is that he says, let be, which means this is a present imperative, meaning this needs to be the lifestyle that you live. This should be your habitual habit. So sometimes we get in the habit of saying things like I swear or I promise or whatever else. We want to really be careful with that. The habitual habit that we should have is that we're paying attention to the words we use and we're using them carefully and simply. That we're careful. Careful not to try and to bolster the language to convince somebody of the promise that we're making, but instead to make it simple. Simple language that can't be misrepresented or misunderstood. Yes means yes. No means no. We don't need somebody to define for us. We don't need a new court system. We don't need somebody to discuss what this is all about. Yes means yes, and no means no. This would avoid the temptation to bolster ourselves through manipulating somebody with language. You know, I think it's interesting with conversation, and I know we get into habits sometimes. I got a really good friend who uses the phrase, to tell the truth. Right? And I appreciate this guy a lot. So as far as I know, he's most often telling the truth, but I'm not so sure when he has to say to tell the truth every time, right? I mean, you can look at that and go, so were you lying a minute ago? Have you already changed? Is this a flip of the channel? What's going on here? But in those ways, sometimes what we're doing is trying to bring emphasis to where we really are, okay? But we can also do that by getting flippant with our promises. Flippant with what we're saying. Flippant with the things that we want to try to convince somebody so bad. The more difficult portion of this particular verse is the end of it. Anything beyond this is of evil. Older translations use this term. Anything beyond this is of the evil one. Fascinating. So when we think of evil, this word's an interesting thing in and of itself, because evil here means that which is opposed to good, not just in that it's in opposition to it or it stands against it, but that it's actually attacking it, it's destructive, that its intention is to tear down what is good. That's the idea of evil here. So when we see this, guys, this isn't something just passive. He says, anything beyond this is of evil. This evil is something that tears down what is good. So we got to be careful. We got to be aware. It's no wonder that James would said what he does in James 5:12, but he says this, sounds like Jesus, but above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but your yes is to be yes and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. Sounds pretty stout, doesn't it? James's whole book is like that. But when we hear this, this is our caution, this is our correction, because the Word of God has been given to us so that it might rebuke and correct and encourage and all the other things that it does for us. So here we are with our caution, looking at it straight in the face. So what's the point? The point is simplicity. Yes, yes, no, no. Careful language. Careful language. Careful use of oath-taking and of promises. Be careful what we were doing. We might find ourselves a steak and shake if we're not careful. Do not implicate the Lord in your false dealings with others and so misrepresent him and even use his name in vain, because that is a use of the Lord's name in vain. What we've done in the past is thought and considered the things in this sort of way, where we say if anybody swears, the bad swear word using God's name or using Jesus' name in a way that's bad and all those, that's using God's name in vain, correct, but so is swearing by him when you don't carry out what you intend to do. That's a vain use of God's name. For us in the world today, I think it's helpful to have an understanding that we need to be people who have integrity of language. What are we saying? Because it's a world full of falsehoods and lies and manipulation of words. It's happening around us all the time. It's not new. When I was a kid, I remember a book that had come out, Horton Hatches an Egg. Ever seen that one? Remember, Horton, here's a who. This is the same Horton. He's an elephant. He's conned in to taking care of an egg that Maisie, the lazy bird, did not want to take care of. She didn't want to sit on that egg all day. So he says yes, he will do it. Good-hearted Horton. He sits on the egg, and he sits on it through a whole season of difficulties, including blizzards, you name it. Everybody's coming to him and says, look, you need to get off that egg. You need to get off. This is crazy. She doesn't care about you. She's gone on vacation while you're sitting doing her work, in essence. And he's there, and he used to say these words. I meant what I meant, and I said, I'm sorry. I said what I meant, and I meant what I said. An elephant's faithful 100%. I said what I meant, and I meant what I said. An elephant's faithful 100%. I like that. I might change the words a little bit. I said what I meant, and I meant what I said. A Christian is faithful 100%. Please know that Jesus is true to his word. He's true to his word indeed. He said, I will go to the cross and I will die, and he did so. He said, I will rise again on the third day, and he did so. Upon his return, which we wait for still, is his name faithful and true. He promised to return, and he will do so. He's promised to take us to his Father's house, and he will do so. Because he is faithful and true. He said what he meant what he said. 100%. I think it's imperative that his followers are those same kind of people. Trustworthy, faithful. Amen? Simple. Simple. For us today, the idea of the faithful and true one, the great I am, helps us to recognize who it is we represent on this earth. We're not representing ourselves, we're representing him. And sometimes we lose track, every now and then, of just how awesome and how great he really is. But may his awesome, great personage adjust us so that our lives would line up well with who he is. That people would recognize us as faithful and true with words and promises. Let's rise and give him glory.